How can you really know where content was made, or even what it's made of? Now more than ever, verified authenticity is critical, especially with the advent of AI. That's why a global community, including companies, organizations, and civic leaders, have come together in the Content Authenticity Initiative.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our conversation on content authenticity for visual storytellers. My name is Jen Tse, and I'm the community manager at Adobe's Content Authenticity Initiative. We're really excited to be bringing all of you together today for this discussion on how digital provenance can help address issues that a lot of visual journalists, storytellers, and media organizations face in their industries. Joining me today will be Santiago Lyon, the CAI's Head of Advocacy and Education, Akili Ramsess, the Executive Director of the National Press Photographers Association, otherwise known as the NPPA, and David Butow, a freelance photojournalist. We'll start with an overview of the CAI and content credentials. Then we'll hear about how content provenance fits into the journalism and media landscape and where these industries are headed. Next, we'll see the NPPA's new implementation of content credentials and discuss digital content provenance in the context of their work. Then we'll see a demo on how visual storytellers and photojournalists can incorporate content credentials at any stage of their workflow. We'll move on to a group discussion with all three guests before opening the floor to a Q&A session at the end. So please feel free to drop your questions in the separate Q&A panel as they come up. But first, a bit about who I am. For over 10 years, I worked in the photojournalism world at Time, Newsweek, National Geographic, and at other media organizations, where it was my job as a photo editor to look at hundreds or even thousands of real photographs from around the world every day, and to be extremely discerning about what was selected for publication. I adhered to strict ethical standards, and any photograph published in a journalistic context had to be grounded in reality and fact. But even with this background, I have been, at least momentarily, fooled by AI. We live in an age of AI-generated images, where hyper-realistic, machine-made creations are increasingly difficult to tell apart from photographs made by recording light from a real moment in time. And the lines between fact and fiction continue to blur with widely available AI image editing tools, increasing public distrust in mainstream journalistic media, and the spread of deepfakes, misinformation, and disinformation. Sometimes it feels like we live in a giant sea of confusion about what and whom we should believe. At the heart of my work in journalism was always a commitment to truthful, trustworthy visual storytelling. Our ability to know how images were made and where they came from, and being able to trust what we see, is critical to our understanding of the world that we live in. That fundamental conviction is what brought me to work at the Content Authenticity Initiative. So what is the CAI? The CAI was established by Adobe in late 2019. Back then, our colleagues at the research lab looked around the corner and they saw the rapid advancement of easy video creation and deepfakes, and they wanted to do something about it. This was part of Adobe's corporate social responsibility effort to make the digital world a little bit safer, as the maker of powerful creative software tools that can be used by anyone, including people with malicious intent. Adobe wanted to get ahead of these issues in a way that wouldn't just benefit Adobe. So everything I'm about to share with you is open source and available to anyone, including Adobe's business competitors. We started just 3 members working together: Adobe, the New York Times Company, and what was then called Twitter. Since then, the community has grown to over 4,500 members in news media, civil society, advertising holding companies, hardware and software companies, and more. We are an Adobe-led community of individuals and organizations across industries and around the world, working together to accelerate adoption of an open technical standard for content provenance. So what is provenance? The term originates from the art world, and it refers to the origin of a piece of work. In a digital context, we're talking about the basic facts about where a piece of content came from. As you all know, Digital files travel fast and can be transformed any number of ways before they reach our eyes. We need more transparency about that journey to help us decide what to believe. Generative AI has been the great disruptor of trust. When it's become so easy to create content that is sophisticated and realistic, no one's personal barometer of trust, even if it's been finely calibrated by years of journalism training, is good enough anymore. We need the evidence, and we need the facts. There is a way to reveal this information to audiences, and it's gaining momentum. Our mission at the CAI is to make content credentials ubiquitous. Content credentials were developed by the C2PA, a technical group co-founded by Adobe that sits within the Linux Foundation. This technology is open source and anyone can adopt it. And we want this interactive icon, the CR pin, to be as universal and instantly recognizable as the copyright symbol, so that it becomes second nature to tap on it and inspect a file's provenance information before you make a trust decision. You can think about content credentials as a nutrition label for content that you see online. When you go to a supermarket, you can pick up a can of beans and you know the facts about what's in it, the number of calories, the amount of salt, how much protein is in it. But the label won't tell you whether or not it's healthy. That's for you to determine for yourself. Content credentials work in a similar way. They might tell you who made a piece of content, how it might have been manipulated in the editing process, whether it was made with a camera or generative AI, and other information. It's a secure and verifiable layer of transparency that can add context and help us decide what's worthy of our trust. And this information is durable against screenshotting and other attacks. So if you're a photojournalist or a visual storyteller who has had your work stolen and used out of context and without credit, content credentials can help trace your work back to you and protect your creative rights. If someone tries to cast doubt on whether your photograph is a photograph, content credentials can prove it and safeguard your credibility. Our work is divided into several stages of the content lifecycle. We work with camera and smartphone manufacturers to integrate this technology at the device level, which means that when you buy a camera or a smartphone, it can come with content credentials support baked into it, and then you can choose to activate it and write the data onto your images at the point of capture. This establishes what device was used to create a photograph, or in the case of generative AI, what tool was used to generate an image. It also secures other metadata like when an image was made. You can also apply content credentials at the editing stage. We integrate this technology into Adobe and non-Adobe editing software because the technical specification, as I mentioned earlier, is open source and available to anyone. So any changes that you might make to a file, like cropping or toning, can be recorded and the edit history can be secured onto the file itself. The next stage is publishing. We work with news media, social media, advertisers, content delivery networks, anybody who's involved with publishing anything online to keep content credentials intact on their platforms throughout any file transformations or workflow processes that might take place, and then display the content credentials data so that they are visible and understandable to audiences. All of this is in service of a clear and universal experience that reveals provenance information so that viewers can read that nutrition label and make an informed trust decision about what they're seeing. The urgency of this work is probably not lost on you all. Fortunately, this movement to make the internet more transparent and trustworthy has made enormous strides really quickly. You can see all of these major milestones that have happened just in the last year. OpenAI, Meta, Google, TikTok, LinkedIn, and Amazon have all joined the standards organization that developed content credentials, called the C2PA, or they've announced implementations of their own. And content credentials were named one of Time's best inventions of 2024. They're now established as the global cross-industry standard, and they're about to be recognized as an ISO standard. So it's a really exciting time for this initiative, and the impacts on the news and media industry will be profound as adoption continues to grow. To speak more on that, I'm now going to invite Santiago Lyon up to the stage. Hello, Santi.
Hello, Jen.
Hello, welcome.
Yes,
So,
great presentation. Thank you.
thank you. So to introduce Santi, he is our head of advocacy and education at the CAI. He has 40 years of experience in photography as an award-winning photojournalist, photo editor, media executive, and educator. As a photographer for Reuters and the Associated Press for 20 years, he won multiple photojournalism awards for his work between 1989 and 1999, where he photographed 9 wars on 4 continents. In 2003 and 2004, he was a Nieman Fellow in Journalism at Harvard University before being named Vice President and Director of Photography at the Associated Press, a position he held until 2016. So, Santi, from your past vast experience in photojournalism and now at the CAI, working with media leadership to accelerate this standard, could you give us an overview of where you see the industry's headed?
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question. At the core of all journalism, in essence, is trust. Trust between consumers of news from news outlets, trust between journalists and the subjects of the stories that they're working on. Trust is really fundamental. And so what the Content Authenticity Initiative does through implementation of the CTPA's content credentials is really provide some empirical evidence about the origins of digital files that will bolster the existing trust premise that exists at the core of all journalism. There's a lot of invisible work that goes on in journalism behind the scenes. The New York Times, for example, or the Associated Press doesn't publish anything unless they're sure that it's met their standards. And in order to be sure of that, they have stuff looked at multiple times by editors, often multiple layers of editors. And when they're confident that it meets their standards for accuracy and for perspective, then it gets published. The content credentials are a way, really, of adding some empirical evidence to that process. It's like a stamp that says, hey, this is a piece of information in the form of a CR icon that indicates that this was published by a particular news entity. And then depending on the relationship between the consumer and that news entity, that can engender trust, or at the very least provide more information to help that consumer make a better informed decision about what it is they're looking at. With that background, it's important to note that the news industry is under a lot of stress right now. Audiences are dropping for younger readers and viewers. The advertising industry fragmented a long time ago with regards to the news industry world. And so there are some real existential crises that are facing the news industry world. So it's not surprising that it's taken the news industry community a little while to get going. But the good news is that that work is underway around the world with a variety of organizations and companies to maintain the content credential from the moment of capture in the camera through the editing process and then on to the publishing process. And in the last 6 months or so, we've seen a lot of work being done by an organization called the IPTC, the International Press and Telecommunications Council, which is a 55 or so year-old organization that has long been focused on standardizing metadata for news agencies and for some consumer-facing news organizations, metadata being key in search, for example. So when the Content Authenticity Initiative came along and content credentials were developed, the IPTC quickly emerged as a logical meeting point, watering hole, if you like, for news media companies to learn about content credentials, how to implement them into their workflows, how to partner with the camera manufacturers and all the various points along the supply chain to make them as durable and useful as possible. And that's the work that's currently underway right now.
So what would you say is the value in being a leader in implementation? So if there's any media organizations in the audience who are maybe considering implementing down the road, what should they do?
Well, one thing that media organizations often struggle with is, where does this live within their organization? Journalists are often very excited about it. Photojournalists are very excited about it, but those people are typically not involved in procurement or in instituting technologies within their organizations. So what I've found over the last couple of years, traveling around the world, talking to news media executives in a variety of places at a lot of different levels, is that the top-down approach is often effective because the people at the tops of those organizations, their role is to look at things strategically, to have the big picture in mind. And so when they're introduced to the notion of content credentials, they typically grasp it instinctively. What happens next, however, is a bit of a mixed bag, because for any project to prosper in any organization, it requires ownership and it requires resources. The companies that have assigned ownership to senior leaders in their organizations and have given those leaders resources, those are the companies who've made the most progress. So where does it logically live then in a news organization? It lives in product, it lives in strategy, it lives in business development. And the value to the news organization, especially in this time of AI, where everything is under a shadow of uncertainty or of doubt, is that it reinforces the news brand and it provides an opportunity for the news brand to say to its readers, say to its consumers, hey, you could always trust, the New York Times, the AP, the Guardian, whoever, Wall Street Journal. Now here's an additional piece of information that bolsters that trust. And so there are real opportunities within the news space, whether it's the sort of the wholesalers, as it were, the news agencies, or the consumer-facing news organizations, the retailers, to take on leadership roles in their geographies, in their regions, in their sectors, and to work together within the broader Content Authenticity Initiative community to implement this, because the value proposition for everybody is clear. It's an additional piece of empirical information that provides more for the viewer to make a better informed decision about what it is they're consuming.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you so much, Santi. I'd now like to invite Akili Ramsess up to the stage. Hello, Akili.
Give me a moment here. It's a little slow. Okay, here we go. Hi.
Oh. Hi. Hello. Yeah. So, to introduce Akili here, Akili is a Pulitzer Prize-winning photo editor and former director of photography at the Orlando Sentinel. She joined the National Press Photographers Association as executive director in 2016. Prior to her work with the Orlando Sentinel, she established a distinguished career with a variety of news organizations, from the Associated Press, Los Angeles Times, Atlanta Journal and Constitution, and the San Jose Mercury News. She's on the advisory board for the Eddie Adams Workshop and the National Association of Black Journalists Visual Task Force. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you, Santi, for laying the groundwork for what we're going to talk about here. NPPA was established over 75 years ago to advocate for the work of visual journalists in all platforms, news photographers, videographers, multimedia journalists. And our code of ethics is probably the standard in the news industry today, which is a real value to motivation for us to get involved with the Content Authenticity Initiative.
So tell us a little bit more about the NPPA's work. How does the NPPA support visual journalists and advance the profession?
Well, we're at the center of a lot of the thorniest issues visual journalists face today. Access, for freedom of the press, First Amendment rights, and we're involved in also training, keeping on top of the latest innovations in the industry to keep our members viable in the workforce, and basically also establishing a level of trust for the ethical standards that we have established. I think that having involvement in the CAI has been a really big step forward for where we want to go with providing assets for our members in the community at large.
So Colleen has now started sharing the NPPA website, and we're really excited to show everyone today the NPPA's new implementation of content credentials. So could you please describe the NPPA's implementation as Colleen shows us visually?
So what we have here is a way for using the CR, you see the CR symbol, that you can click on it, get the information of the different layers, what's involved in the photograph, if there's been any cropping, any toning, just the different steps any may have happened with that particular image. I think it allows photographers to also establish their copyright and ownership of images.
What was the process like for the NPPA for implementing? Can you tell us about any challenges that you came across? And these can be bureaucratic challenges, it could be workload challenges, it could be technical challenges, anything about your experience you'd like to share.
Well, it was primarily the technical integration with our website, and CAI was also evolving as we were developing our platform to incorporate CAI. So those are and I have to thank our developer, Gareth Doughton, and the Arbavita team, and our project manager, past president, Andrew Stanfield, really were the worker bees behind the scenes developing our platform. So a lot of deal with the integration between the back end of our website with all the technical implementation with CAI.
And just for context, the CAI has a thriving community that uses our open source tools to help implement the content credentials standard. We have a Discord server where CAI team members answer questions about implementation and where community members can connect. So the NPPA advocates for the legal rights of visual journalists, including First Amendment access, copyright, and more. How do you see content credentials and the ability to prove provenance information potentially playing a role in your advocacy work?
I think primarily giving photographers the tools to prove copyright ownership. And it's a pretty big deal right now with people think that because the image is on the website, they can grab it and use it to whatever the needs they want it for without remuneration for the photographer or credit of any sort. So I think this is a way for us to be able to have photographers protect their source. Really, it was their source of income and their living from licensing images. So that's a major part right there.
So being able to prove who applied a content credential to a file, who owns the file, can help when someone is looking for legal recourse if something is stolen.
Correct. And
oh, go ahead.
Well, and the other leg is as publishers, like we have our own website and publication, our photo competition, the best of photojournalism. We haven't directly had a problem with this before, but other major contests have had issues with images submitted that turned out been either heavily manipulated or even combined with several other photographs from other photographers. So what the new rules have been established in the last few years was having photographers submit raw files as a way of checking the originality of the image. Having CAI will now eliminate that need. We can, as a viewer, we can now look and see the provenance of an image and see if it has been manipulated to beyond ethical standards.
Are there any examples of previous legal cases where the availability of content credentials could have made a difference?
Not specifically that I can think of. I mean, you have, I think primarily just one-on-one lawsuits between photographers and users who to say they've used my images incorrectly, they've taken the image and have manipulated to such a way that they don't give credit to the photographer. And that's what usually kind of ends up in court. Like I think there was one case like Mannion versus Coors Brewing, where the photographer had created some images for Coors, more of a storyboard as an example, and then they went on to use hired another photographer, an illustrator, to use the image, but not to credit or pay the original photographer on something like that. So I think that would probably have been a case that they could have proven that steps were taken. They were using elements of his image for that advertising bit.
So you mentioned earlier the NPPA Code of Ethics and the guidelines for visual integrity are still the photojournalism industry standard for what manipulations are acceptable. And it follows traditional techniques that would be available in a darkroom. But a consumer of news might inspect a content credential and not understand what constitutes an unethical manipulation versus a change that abides by that code of ethics. They might just see that Photoshop was used and they think, oh, it's been Photoshopped, I can't trust it. So in an ideal world, how would that distinction be communicated to the reader or the viewer?
I know publications are using kind of language that explain this image has either been manipulated or not manipulated. There's, I think, having the CR on there and just probably educating the public, like the actual ethics rule that we have that would apply to that is where we say editing should maintain the integrity of the photographic image, content, and context. Do not manipulate images or add or alter sound in any way that can mislead viewers and misrepresent subjects. And so I think having those code of ethics, I think being more, providing more transparency on the image so we can knock down that fake news label that people get. I think publishers have to kind of go out of their way and add a little bit more explainer to the public so they understand how this image was brought to them.
Mm-hmm. Do you think the code of ethics could ever be amended as technology and the available techniques shift? Because a lot of the traditional techniques like dodging and burning and cropping to a certain extent are permissible and are acceptable in photojournalism. But then we have, for example, dust removal from a camera sensor, which is okay because the dust was not part of the scene of what was going on before the photograph was taken. But if there is an AI image editing tool that helps you remove that dust, things start to get a little bit gray into the gray area. So do you think the code of ethics could ever be amended as the techniques shift?
I think so. I mean, it's under discussion now, actually. We're trying to say what more can we say and do, and we just haven't come to a consensus yet how, as the AI evolves, I think we're waiting to see where we need to shore up those ethics to reflect that change. But right now it's just in the discussion stages, and I think we still just apply the overall. For straight editorial news, you do not manipulate or alter an image. I think people need to be very clear on the distinction between something that's straight news that you can't alter, but if you're into the more creative and illustrative side, that there's no limit to what you can do with that. But I think a distinction has to be made about what's real, what's news, and documenting an event versus creating something for illustrative purposes.
Right, and that comes back to this transparency because, if you are creating a portrait, for example, that is staged. Someone is sitting down and taking time to create this image, or a photo illustration. At other organizations I worked at, it had to be very clear in the caption or in the credit information, photo illustration. You can't use the word photograph because once you're combining multiple elements or once you're staging a scene in a way that's permissible in a feature story, then it's no longer technically a photograph in a news sense.
Exactly.
Thank you so much, Akili. I'd now like to invite David onto the stage.
Greetings.
Hello, David. Welcome, welcome.
Thanks, Jen.
So, David is a California-based photojournalist who has worked in over a dozen countries covering feature and news stories such as economic growth in China, the 2003 US invasion of Iraq, and the Hong Kong democracy protests in 2019. More recently, his work in Washington from 2017 to 2021, culminating in the attack on the Capitol on January 6th, resulted in his book, Brink, published in 2021 by Punctum Press. He's a member of the agency Redux Pictures, and his work has been published on the covers of Time and Newsweek magazines, and has won awards from World Press Photo, Pictures of the Year International, and others. So David will now present what we like to call a glass-to-glass workflow, showing how content credentials can be incorporated from the moment he takes a picture with a camera to the moment it's published on a screen. David, please take it away.
Great, thanks, Jen. So I have a 5-minute demonstration video here showing the workflow that photographers can use right now, independent of the needs of or the requests of any client. But in my case, it starts with the camera, which is the Leica M11P that has credentials built into it. You can turn that on and off. You can also add your copyright and produced by. You can type your name in there. Like that. And so the point is, when you go out and shoot the assignment or take any pictures, from the moment of capture, the camera has encrypted metadata onto your file. So then you take your card, you download your card as you normally would. Everybody's got different methods for doing this. You can do it onto your directly onto your laptop, onto an external hard drive. In this case here, I'm just going to do it right onto my desktop. This is an assignment I did recently for the LA Times. So then I'm taking my folder, the raw files from the folder right off the card, and I'm dragging that into Lightroom. And in this case, I know specifically which picture I want to choose. So these are hosts of a morning radio show in LA, very perky group of people here. So I'm doing the normal adjustments that I would do in Lightroom, bit of toning, some color correction, a little bit of dodge here. And so up to this point, everything I've done is just how you would normally work. If you've got a camera that attaches the credential, you're just doing your workflow in Lightroom as you normally would. I'm adding metadata, caption info onto the picture as normal. And now I'm ready to export the file. And this is where the CR technology is going to come into play in the post-processing part. So I've got different options here on the menu. I'm going to publish this to the Content Credentials Cloud. All right. So this requires you to be you're connected to the internet. You've signed on using your Adobe account. So now all the post-processing that I've done on the file is now attached to the file. It's uploaded, and excuse me. Now I've exported the file onto my desktop, and I go into Chrome, and using now the ACA website, you see there's a couple of different options. There's apply and inspect. So I'm now going to apply the credentials to my processed file. And you can see on the Zoom here, you have the option of adding your social media handles. You can opt out of generative AI training if you want, and then you're affirming here that you're the owner of these credentials. Again, you're signed on to Adobe, so that's how you're able to make that link. And then you click apply onto the file, and this is pretty much real time. So that's about how long it takes to apply the credential. Now you see the CR logo is now part of that file, and then you download the file with the credential attached. So I've done that. Now I'm going to drag that downloaded file onto my desktop, and that is now ready to send to the client. You can see the name has been modified to have CR right before the JPEG. So you've got your picture or pictures ready to send to the client. In this case, it was published in the LA Times on the website here. So I'm going to demonstrate now how I can take a screenshot of the picture as it was published, then drag that into the same web page, that ACA web page, but this time I've clicked inspect, and you can see there's the picture. That screenshot doesn't have any credentials on it. but the image, the content of the image has been uploaded now. And if I click onto that picture, you can see the 3 different steps along the way. So it shows you here where the credentials have been added from the ACA website. The second version here shows my adjustments in Lightroom. Okay, and then finally the very origin of the picture, which came from my cameras. So basically, you're able to see now each step of the way and how the picture has changed, going, starting with the picture as it was published, going all the way back to the very first image capture.
Hello again, I'm back. Thank you, David. So David just showed us how you can apply content credentials at any stage of your workflow. So in the camera that he used, at the editing process, and finally at publishing, and the 3 tools that are involved in that. Let's talk about your ability to assert the provenance of your images. What does that mean for you as a photojournalist? Have you noticed any tangible benefits already?
I'm not sure that I've noticed any tangible benefits yet, but I think one of the key points is, as Santiago and Akili were talking about, there's a variety right now of levels of adoption that different media organizations are doing. So the NPPA is very much at the forefront, using their code of ethics and their technology and their efforts to establish parameters of photojournalism, but different publications are adopting this at different rates. But that doesn't mean that the photographer can't start using this right away. And it may be applicable to something that your client is asking for right now, but if not, you still secured the provenance of your picture if you have a camera that does it from the moment of capture, or if you don't, but you've done it then later in software, you know that you've kind of locked that in a way that if there's any question about your picture, either right away as it's published or even 5 years from now, you've got that kind of protection baked into your image.
Right. It must offer a lot of peace of mind just to know that, as you saw, someone can screenshot your image, but you can still trace it back to you.
Yeah, very much so.
On the site for 10 years from now, for longer.
Exactly, right.
So this content credentials technology is still quite new. It's still being iterated on, and there's room for imagination as the landscape shifts, as adoption accelerates, and as usage changes. So how else would you envision content credentials being used to inform and educate? What information could be displayed in that nutrition label?
Right, and I think as you were talking with Akili about the different parameters of photojournalistic, ethics of ways that that photographers can do toning and changing pictures, and I think that it will add to the level of trust that viewers have in terms of being able to feel more credibility from the images that they see and from the websites. And I think there'll be sort of an evolution of a greater understanding of what photographers, what photojournalists are doing specifically to be ethical and to make that make a distinction between those methods and other methods, whether it's AI or heavier forms of photo manipulation. So I think it's going to be an opportunity, in fact, to sort of educate the public on what some of these parameters are.
Thank you so much, David. I'd now like to invite all of our speakers back on stage for our group discussion. Hello again, welcome back. So,
Can't get there.
we can hear you though.
Okay.
So my first question is for Santi and David. Let's talk about levels of disclosure. So David really showed us what it's like when you apply levels of disclosure at every possible stage of the workflow. Does an ideal workflow always include content credentials at every stage, from capture to edit to signing? Or are there instances where you might choose to disclose less? And can you tell us more about when those might be?
Sure. I mean, the level of granularity, we can capture a lot of detail in a content credential at every step of the process. The identity of the photographer, the time, the day, the location, the settings of the camera, organizational affiliation, a whole host of things, who edited the picture, who distributed the picture, all of those details. But there are obviously sometimes security or privacy concerns around all of that stuff, and not everybody is comfortable sharing all of that information. And in some cases, they probably shouldn't. So, for example, a photojournalist working in a conflict zone would be ill-advised to share their GPS location, because it could make them a target with fatal results, as we've seen in previous conflicts. Or a human rights defender working under an oppressive regime probably doesn't want their identity inextricably associated with a piece of damning content around a human rights abuse. So ultimately, everything is customizable, and the user and the publisher can choose how much or how little information they feel comfortable sharing. There are probably some lowest common denominators there, in terms of whether an image was created with a camera or whether it was created with AI. But of course, it's not a binary proposition where everything is either AI or it's not, right? There's a lot of blending of different tools to create different effects. So I think over time, as this technology rolls out more broadly, there will likely be conventions adopted by different sectors in terms of how much information they feel comfortable sharing. So, for example, in the news industry, where there's a lot of very innocuous standard post-production work done on pictures to make them more easily readable and to account for the differences between how the photographer's eye captured or remembered a scene and how the camera sensor remembered a scene, understanding that the human eye is much more sophisticated than a camera sensor. It's not unusual for photojournalists to lighten shadows or darken highlights or more accurately represent the scene as they remember it. But news media companies are reluctant to share that kind of information with the public, primarily because of educational scenarios where media literacy among the public is perhaps not as advanced as we might like it to be. So there's a trepidation about sharing standard post-production, not because it's misleading, but because it could be misunderstood. So the how of an image, there's some concerns and some caution need to be taken there. However, the who created the image is often really important to photojournalism, whether it's the name of the photographer or whether it's the news media company or the brand and what it represents. So in the news media case, I think there's going to be more emphasis on the who rather than the how, whereas in other sectors, it's quite the opposite, where there's fears that identity could become weaponized. And so there's much more emphasis on the how as opposed to the who. So over time, I think everything will settle down and conventions will be established and expectations will be set. But the last thing I'll say is that the technology is only going to get us so far. And there are two other really important areas here that we spend a fair amount of time focused on in the CAI organization. One is the area of education. So that's classroom education, societal education, consumer education. What is a content credential? What does it mean? How to use it, et cetera. And then the other area that's also very important is the area of policy, where increasingly around the world you're seeing legislation passed that will mandate some level of transparency around the use of AI. And so content credentials have touch points in the technology, obviously, but then also in education and policy. And when we look at those things holistically, they elevate the conversation to the one of societal importance that we think it deserves, but we also create more entry points for people to get engaged, because not everybody's enamored of technology. However, when you add education and policy into the mix, there are typically more touch points for people to be able to participate in the conversation.
How about you, David?
Yeah, I think those are all great points. And yeah, the key thing about this is an evolution. This is relatively new technology. I think that even outside of, we're talking about this in the photojournalistic context, but I think even just photography in general, even if you're doing fine art photography, you may not want to show all the steps that you did in post-processing. That's part of your secret sauce or something, if what you're doing is primarily showing pictures in galleries or something like that. But still having the ability to encrypt your image either from the moment of capture or at some early step along the way to kind of secure your copyright with that image and associate yourself with that image in the beginning. That's very relevant in that field as well.
My next question is for Santi and Akili. So both of you have experience in groups that are considered arbiters of photojournalism industry standards, like the NPPA and the Associated Press. As news organizations continue to grapple with when and how to ethically integrate the use of AI tools, do you see any guidelines or use cases emerging for how AI can be used responsibly? An example would be that, there's an example of people using voice cloning to tell the story of someone who has passed, or using AI to sift through a lot of data that a journalist would not be able to sift through on their own in a timely manner. So is there any examples of this in the visual world where it can be used in a way that is in line with journalistic ethics?
I think possibly in the area of illustration. There are certain stories that are very difficult to photograph, either because there are access issues or because they deal with topics that don't loan themselves to visuals, the financial industry, aspects of the technology industry. And I think that AI can be used to generate illustrations that convey information visually in a way that helps the viewer understand the topic at hand. But I think the key thing here is that those be very clearly labeled and perceived as illustrations, that they not attempt to be photorealistic, that they not attempt to muddy the waters or confuse the viewer as to what it is they're looking at, that they very clearly look like drawings or technical drawings or sketches or whatever the appropriate use might be. I can see a use for AI in that context of visual journalism, but with a very clear marker between that and photorealistic images that could be, confused, etc.
Yeah, that's great. I see I'm actually hearing from a lot of news organizations who are reaching out to us, trying to find understanding how to use AI. They have diminished staff. I'm seeing this as a possible new lane of job opportunities for visual expertise to be able to not only teach and demonstrate what are good ethical boundaries and how to best use AI, but to have people of visual expertise and ethical backgrounds who could work with staffs to implement how they use visuals, whether it's using AI or not, or the best way to implement using AI when you have smaller staffs to be able to produce images for organization. But I think it still has to be a clear demarcation of, as Santi mentioned, that use it for certain illustrative purposes, or how are you using it in maybe just a workflow process for news events. So I think there's a lot of different opportunities, but I think you have to have someone who has who can provide guidelines for news organizations.
Thank you all. Let's turn over to the Q&A window now and see what's going on. Lots going on in here. So we have a question from Roger Vikström. I'm a photographer from Stockholm, Sweden, using a Nikon Z9. Do you know when that will be embedded in the Nikon Z9? I think you can answer that one.
Sure. We've been doing a lot of work with Nikon and other camera manufacturers to implement this in available, commercially available cameras. Leica was the first one out the door over a year ago with the M11P that David showed us a a little while ago. They've now added the technology to a mirrorless camera, the SL3. So they've been really bullish on this. The Japanese manufacturers have been working diligently. Sony has had some public announcements about using content credentials. Leica have been working, Nikon rather, have been working on some prototypes. And the other Japanese manufacturers are all headed in the same direction. I think later this year, probably in the second half of this year, we're going to see some movement from the Japanese camera manufacturers with regards to commercially available tools that are C2PA enabled.
This one is from Jeff Seelbach. How is CAI thinking about the tension between transparent and trustworthy credentials and the need to protect the identity of sources, journalists, or the locations in certain contexts? So we touched on that a little bit, but maybe Santi, you can tell us a little bit more about the practice of redaction.
Yeah, I mean, it's like we addressed before. It's the technology needs to be used responsibly and safely, and it would defeat the purpose if it was used in a way that put people at risk or compromised sources, etc. So each sector, and there are multiple sectors here. Photojournalism is but one. We're dealing with creatives, we're dealing with AI, we're dealing with companies, insurance, law enforcement, all sorts of other use cases. But in the case of photojournalism, it's important to remember what's at stake here for people who talk to journalists, have their photographs taken, etc. So the responsible use is really important. And the ability to include or not include certain information is always there. And I think that as this gets adopted more broadly in the photojournalism space, there will be, guidelines set out by the likes of organizations like the NPPA or like the Associated Press or other organizations that take on leadership roles, so that this technology is used, with the goals in mind of transparency and additional information to help readers and viewers make better informed decisions about what it is they're looking at.
This one's from Mike Ginn. At the beginning of the Q&A, you mentioned that you wouldn't just be able to screenshot a photograph to avoid the content credentials. Can you elaborate on how this works? It sounds great, but I'm worried the concept functions closer to how, say, Netflix won't let you screenshot a show in a web browser. So I think we shared a link to our article on durable content credentials in the chat window. But basically, there's a combination of 3 different technologies that work together: cryptographically secure metadata, invisible watermarking, and digital fingerprinting. And the 3 technologies reinforce each other to provide durability for the content credential wherever it's shared. And you can read more about that in the article that was shared in the chat. If it's lost somewhere up there in the chat, we can reshare it. Let's see. Next question. Question for speakers from Dave Aaron. Do you see competing organizations or standards to the CAI and C2PA, or is this the only game in town? I'm specifically wondering about whether this is penetrating all countries around the world.
Well, the C2PA is a really remarkable organization. As you indicated, Jen, it was co-founded by Adobe together with Microsoft and the BBC and TruePic and others. And it sits within the Linux Foundation as what's called the Joint Development Foundation project. And what that means is that the output of the C2PA is unencumbered by IP. Nobody owns it. It's available for anybody and everybody to use. Since it got going in 2021, the C2PA is now working with over 500 technology companies, large, medium, small. And the work is incredibly exacting and rigorous and detailed and robust and comprehensive. And that's why it's on the way to becoming an ISO standard. And it really has emerged as best in class for provenance, because there's an opportunity for companies and individuals to participate in the C2PA and have a seat at the table with regards to making the standard more robust. There are different iterations. Like most standards, it iterates. Different versions come along periodically to reflect learnings and to reflect realities and changing situations. So I think the short answer is, yeah, it is not the only game in town. There are others out there who are approaching this slightly differently, but it seems to have emerged as the most comprehensive and the most broadly supported standard for provenance. And that's great because that ensures interoperability. If everybody is using the same technical standard, it means that it's interoperable across different industries, different platforms, different sectors, and that contributes to the robustness of it. In terms of global penetration, that's part of the work of the Content Authenticity Initiative, is to accelerate adoption of the C2PA standards. So we've been working in Europe, in North America, in Latin America, now increasingly in Asia, and we're seeing a steady stream of adoption and implementation across a wide variety of industry sectors, which speaks well to the resilience of the standard.
This question is from Richard Anderberg. Are content credentials intended for photos only, or video, voice, and text as well?
It's applicable to photos, video, audio, generative AI, 3D imagery, that kind of stuff. Text is a little bit more complicated because of the amorphous nature of text. It can be applied to the container that text comes in, the file format, but loose text itself is a work in progress. So it's really aimed at those first formats that I mentioned for now.
I saw another related question. Let me find it. Yes, from Joe Coleman. How and when can I integrate this into videos created in Adobe Premiere Pro? Do AI platforms like Sora and Runway participate?
Yeah, so it's coming to Premiere Pro later this year. With regards to the Gen AI companies, so OpenAI, DALL-E 3, Sora, they now apply content credentials upon download. So if you create something in those programs, they get a content credential when you download it. The same is true for Adobe's suite of Gen AI programs called Firefly, text image, text video. Other players in that space seem inclined to also add content credentials upon download, but that's a work in progress. So I think as this becomes adopted and as legislation begins to mandate this, we saw a couple of weeks ago in Spain, for example, where they've taken the EU's AI Act and decided to implement it very bullishly. And their goal is to penalize publishers who do not disclose the use of AI in their content. And so we're interested in talking with them about the possible use of C2PA content credentials towards that end. But I think that's where things are headed in some geographies, is this notion of, if you're going to use AI, you have to disclose it. In the same way that when genetically modified foods came out, they needed to be clearly labeled. So the supermarket analogy that we've touched on earlier, I think, remains useful in these cases.
We are just about out of time. So that about wraps us up. Thank you, Santi, Akili, and David, for presenting. Thank you all so much for being here today. We just have 2 calls to action for everyone in the audience today. The first one is to join the waitlist for Adobe Content Authenticity, so that if you are a visual journalist, artist, or another type of visual storyteller, you can start using this free tool as soon as it's released to sign and protect your work with content credentials. The second call to action would be to join the CAI to stay up to date on the latest updates on generative AI and deepfakes, developments in the content provenance ecosystem, and events like this one. And Colleen will drop both of those links in the chat. This movement for a more transparent and trustworthy internet and our ability to safeguard credibility in visual journalism and storytelling is only possible if everyone, from individual creators to organizations, works together to adopt this standard of content credentials. I am so excited for all the change and progress that will come with our collective efforts. Thank you all again for being here, and I hope to see you again at the next CAI event.